Hi everyone, is it the season of witching, or have I just been convinced by all of you to do this video well in advance by a poll on Twitter? Because it's obviously the latter. Halloween is still a little while away, but in some respect it's really nice to get videos like this up in advance in case any of you are making TBRs for the month of October. And like I said, it was a very strong winner that took the lead on a poll I ran on Twitter to see which video you'd like to see next, which is of course, as you can tell by the title, witchy books. So I've actually done two videos like this in the past, specifically one on dragon books and one on fairy books, and it's something I'd like to work my way through with different forms of magical creature. So maybe vampires in the future, or any others that you have suggestions for, elves say, but today obviously we are here to talk about books featuring prominently witches. And we have the good witches, we have the bad witches, we have the fierce feminist witches and everything in between. So if you are looking for something witchy to read, whether it be for Halloween or any other time of the year, just stay watching. So the vast majority of books on this list do have a fantastical focus. They would be considered fantasy novels, whereas this first one, although there are elements of that and hints at genuine witchcraft, feels much more like a historical fiction novel. So for those of you that want something like that, I thought I would start there. And that is Cunning Women by Elizabeth Lee. As I've already mentioned, this one very much roots itself in history. It is set not long after the most famous sort of British witch trials in the wake of James VI of Scotland and James I of England's reign of terror down upon women across the country, let's be honest. And it's specifically set in 17th century Lancashire in a rural community, a farming community, where we follow one family in particular and the eldest daughter of this family. There is a mother, a son, an older daughter and a younger daughter. The mother is a practicing witch. She practices herbal remedies and charms and spells that she sells to the locals. But as much as the locals like to come at night and buy charms and potions and sort of healing herbs from her, they also shun her from everyday life, especially since her husband died, the father of her children died, and she had to start making a living this way. Her eldest daughter, who is our narrator for a large part of this book, also appears to have inherited the craft. She has the devil's mark, which is a superstition surrounding witches from this historical period, and she's unsure of really who she wants to be, where she wants to be. Does she want to be accepted by their local community, or does she want to live a life like her mother? They live in effectively abject poverty, and like I said, scrape together ends meet via the sort of herbs that their mother sells. Plus we follow a young farmer, the son of the local farmer, who becomes a little bit fascinated by this young woman. They're of a similar age and they both see in one another a sort of kindred soul. They're drawn to one another, both feeling uncomfortable in their current shoes, in their current circumstances, and part of their community. So together they ignite the very beginnings of a forbidden romance that everybody would object to, including both of their families. However, there is more going on than just the personal there. There is also the wider issue of a magistrate who has come in to this community and is threatening to crack down on women's rights, on witchcraft, and there are magical elements. This book has that hint of magic, but it very much reads like historical fiction. It's beautifully written and I would highly recommend it. If you'd like something else with a bit of a historical twist that's set in a historical period but is definitely strongly situated in the fantasy genre, then I would also recommend the first in the Blackthorn and Grimm series by Juliet Marillier, which is Dreamer's Pool. So witch is something, so this book is witchy, although the term witch isn't really used that much throughout this novel, but it's one that I definitely think you'd enjoy if that's what you're looking for. It's about two main characters, Grimm, a kindly giant of a man who has a dark past that we don't know about, as well as Blackthorn, a very temperamental, wise woman who escapes from prison at the very beginning of the book with Grimm. They are both imprisoned for whatever reason for going against the status quo in quite a corrupt society, and yet they escape with the help of a fae, only to head off on this adventure together and undertake a new life living in this cottage in a local like princedom or fiefdom, where they take on this role as server of the community. So like Blackthorn serves in a wise woman capacity again, making herbal remedies, and Grim hangs around to do labouring work and help build this shack up that they've been living in, and they are the most like companionable duo. There is a romance in this novel, but it's the most slow burn. Like, don't expect any payoff in either of the first two books in the trilogy. It's something that you really have to commit to waiting for, but it's worth it, and the characters themselves are so wonderful. It's so interesting to learn about their pasts and to see them grow as people together, as well as solve some magical mysteries. Yes, they do sort of end up pulled into solving what end up being kind of magical mysteries in the local kingdom, and it feels like beautiful medieval Irish witchy fae Sherlock Holmes, and it's everything. Moving on to something much more contemporary, we have the series that really cemented my love of witchcraft in literature, that really informed a lot of my taste when it comes to witchcraft in literature, and that is the Sweep or Wicca series by Kate Tiernan. So it's been published as the Sweep series in some countries and the Wicca series in other countries, although now I think you can only buy it as the Sweep series, although my old editions, which are on my childhood bookshelf, all say Wicca all over them. But this is set in North America and follows a teenage girl named Morgan, who has grown up in a Christian family, you know, living a very ordinary life. She has two best friends, a boy and a girl, but everything changes when this new boy begins attending their school named Cal. And Cal decides to invite his classmates to a Wiccan gathering. He and his mother and his family are Wiccan, and he introduces some of his classmates who are interested to the Wiccan faith, and it is not for all of them, whereas others are intrigued, including Morgan. Despite having this very different upbringing, she finds this real affinity within herself to Wicca and the practice of Wicca as a faith, and that is something that I really like throughout this book series, although it is very much like fast-paced YA fantasy adventure with a bit of romance thrown in there and some darker moments and some more dramatic moments. It also feels very respectful of Wicca as a faith, and I think that that is incredibly wonderful, and I loved Morgan's growth as a character and her whole story throughout the series. There's 14 books in it, they're all quite short, and I think they are now purchased in bind-ups of 3, which makes sense given how short they are. I adored this series as a kid, but I adored these books as a teenager. It's one of my favourite series, but I actually read it again in my 20s and still think it is excellent and would highly recommend it. Another one of my foundational novels in witchy literature was the Witches series by Terry Pratchett. So this is a series within Terry Pratchett's Discworld series, which are 40 books, are all set on the same planet of his own creation, and I would always recommend the Discworld very, very highly. I think I did a video on it way back in the days telling you where you might like to start, and one of those places is with the Witches series. So the first book in that series is the Weird Sisters. So some of the characters in Weird Sisters and in the Witches series in general have cropped up previously to those books and after those books, particularly in Equal Rights, but those books don't have a focus on the coven of witches and their life as witches to the same extent that Weird Sisters and the following on books do. So Weird Sisters is about 3 witches who make up a coven: Granny Weatherwax, Nanny Og, and Magret, who is called Margaret and not Margaret because her mother couldn't spell. And I love these characters. They all have very fierce, strong, independent and different personalities, which both complement one another but also cause a bit of upset between them. And Weird Sisters in particular has tons of Shakespearean references within it. It has lots of puns to do with Shakespeare. There's lots of references to Shakespearean plays, because part of the novel's story is that there is a travelling theatre group passing through Lancre, which is where the witches live in the Discworld, and the drama that ensues because of this, and potential heirs to the throne who never knew they were heirs to the throne, and the witches' sort of involvement in that. These books are hilarious. Every book Terry Pratchett ever wrote was absolutely hilarious, so this is particularly perfect for anybody who likes a bit of comedy. But it's also the book in the series which contains some of my favourite fictional witches of all time. I mean, Granny Weatherwax and Nanny Og are phenomenal. I do actually have a graphic novel to include on this list, which is Mooncakes, written by Suzanne Walker and illustrated by Wendy Zhu. So this one is about 2 young people in a small village in North America, both of whom are of Chinese American descent, and one of whom is a young witch who works in her grandmother's like witchcraft shop, and the other is a non-binary werewolf, and they both knew each other as children, but they've come back together in recent years now that they're a little bit older and rekindled their friendship and potential romance. So there's also awesome queer representation here, both in the characters themselves and in the relationship that they have with one another, which I adore. But not all witches in this universe are as nice as our protagonist, and it turns out that our werewolf is in danger. So can their childhood friend save them? It is such a beautiful graphic novel, both in terms of content, writing, and illustrations. The illustrations are beautiful. I kind of wish I did own a physical copy. I don't. I read the e-version because it is just one that I would like to sort of like flip back through and admire. However, whichever way you end up picking it up, I'm sure you're going to love it because it is just beautiful and spectacular. If you'd like something that's very heavy on the romance, however, then I would recommend checking out Black Witch Magic by Mila Nix, which is a romance novel with a paranormal mystery at the centre. This is such a fun novel. The characters are so well rounded, they have such incredible chemistry. There's also a lot of humour and levity in it, but more serious issues at the same time, and I love the way it handles friendship and romantic relationships throughout the story. It's about Celine, who is a witch, although she has to hide this from most of the people she knows, and her family was cursed to never leave the town in which she was born. So she's lived their entire life, she's never been able to leave, she cannot cross the town's boundaries, and her whole world is flipped upside down when a young paranormal investigator comes to town. So our romantic love interest in this novel is a paranormal investigator for this streaming show, but he's a skeptic. He doesn't actually really believe in the paranormal. All of that potentially changes, however, when he both meets Celine and also discovers that there may be a paranormal sort of entity causing havoc in this town. So like a little bit Scooby-Doo, but a romance novel, and it's brilliant. Would highly recommend. Another one that's heavy on the romance side is Serpent and Dove by Shelby Mahurin. So this is either YA or new adult. I feel like it maybe falls slightly more into the new adult age range, but all of these lines are very blurred and kind of difficult to separate sometimes, so I don't know actually what the author specifically considers the book to be, but it's definitely on the older side of young adult, if it is young adult. I adore it, however. I just picked up the sequel and cannot wait to read it because the first one just had me turning those pages like mad. It was such a page turner, and I became so invested in the romance despite the fact that it's quite a hefty book. And this story is about a witch who lives in a fantastical world that has sort of 17th, 18th century France vibes, but that's not exactly where it's set. It's set in a fantastical world. And in this world, the church is very much in charge. The church is entirely made up of men, and they rule this country with a very hard fist against women and particularly witches. But although women, and any women, can be accused of witchcraft and can be punished for witchcraft, much like in the historical witch trials in our real world, there are real witches as well. Not to say there weren't Wiccan practitioners back then, but you know, there's like magical, fantastical fantasy witches in this scenario who have to keep themselves hidden but also present a major threat to the church. And our young witch ends up tricked into marrying one of the men of this church, a young man who follows the church blindly, who has accepted its truth, and who ends up, like I said, married to this young witch, unaware that she is a witch. Yes, it's a slightly convoluted sort of beginning to a story, but it works. And I loved it, and I loved them both, and I loved their character growth, and I cannot wait to see what happens next. We're flitting back and forth all over the place, so returning to the contemporary world, we have the Casa Witch series by Nnedi Okorafor. So this is one that's definitely young adult, and it's actually maybe on the younger side of young adult because our characters are very much in their pre-teens and early teens. We follow Sunny, who is a young albino girl whose family have recently moved back to Nigeria. So she's spent all of her life up until this point living living in America, although her brothers were born in Nigeria and her parents were born in Nigeria, so it's a bit of an adjustment for her. It's a new beginning to her life, it's a change to her life. More than the things that you would ordinarily expect from moving countries and schools, however, the biggest change is that she discovers she's a witch. So she didn't know this. She finds out that she's a leopard person, which is what magic practitioners are called in her culture, and ends up attending a sort of after school club to learn more about being a leopard person and magic. And she takes these classes with 3 other local children, all of whom have these abilities. And it is a dark novel. It may be young adult, but it does not shy away from the darker possibilities in this world, because there is actually a serial killer on the loose who appears to be hunting down and killing leopard people that puts Sunny and her friends in danger. Fantastic series, would highly recommend. I actually only have one more YA book on this list, so I'll cover that one now, and that is Perfectly Preventable Deaths by Deirdre Sullivan. So this is a novel set in contemporary Ireland, and it follows 2 twins, predominantly one of the twin girls, but we have 2 twin sisters who are travelling to their new home with their mother and their new stepfather. And their new stepfather lives in what is effectively a castle. He's like the richest man in this small town in Ireland, and they go to live in this very strange and eerie castle, but also town, because everyone there is just like a bit odd. The community is just a little bit odd, and it feels like there's a lot of secrets going round and things that people aren't telling them. One of the sisters, the one that we are not reading the story from the perspective of, ends up in a relationship with a much older man, and the sister who's narrating this story sees how toxic this relationship is but doesn't know what she can possibly do about it, because they're coping very differently with their new surroundings. And she's also discovering that she might be gay, so she is going through this whole massive like upheaval of her own, but wants to protect her sister. But maybe the best thing that she can do for both herself, her sister, her mum and her stepdad is to look down the path that is calling to her, which is witchcraft. This is such a fun novel. I absolutely flew through it. I loved the issues it explored to do with, like I said, toxic relationships, coming out, new starts, grief, and it is so excellent. Would highly recommend. If you were specifically hoping for something horror-esque from this video, because I know a lot of these books aren't necessarily horror despite containing witches and it being the spooky season, then the one that I would steer you towards is White is for Witching by Helen Oyemi. So this is one of my favourite horror novels. It's probably on the literary side of horror. It's stunning to read. The writing is absolutely beautiful, which is true of all of Helen Oyemi's books. And it's about a young woman and a house. So it's about a young woman who has just completed high school, secondary school in the UK and has gone off to university. She lives in this house with her father and her brother that has been inherited through the female side of her family. So it's come down to them through her mother and her grandmother, and they've always lived in this house, and this house has always belonged to them, but more than that, they've always belonged to this house because her family is said to be from a line of witches. She's supposed to be descended from a witch, her mother was possibly a witch, her grandmother was possibly a witch, and the witchcraft is all tied up in this house. But it's one of those books that when you're reading it, it's difficult really to tell to what extent this is rumour, to what extent this is atmosphere, or whether there's really some truth in this witchcraft. The only thing that really makes it feel quite sinister and real is the fact that alternate chapters are told from the perspective of the house. So you get the perspective of this house, which is incredibly possessive and does not want to let any of the women in this family go. It is, like I just said, incredibly eerie and captivating and incredible to read about. Plus, there is sapphic representation in there as well. Then last but not least for this list, I'm going to include a Greek myth retelling, yes, because it is of course Circe by Madeline Miller. This book isn't one that I necessarily think of straight away when I think of witchy books, but Circe is not just a goddess, she is a witch, and she is the goddess of witches. She is somebody that witchcraft practitioners and magic practitioners looked up up to in ancient Greek society. She's somebody that Medea learns from in myth, and I just feel like it would be a bit of a dishonour to not mention her here. So Circe, as you know, is a story of Circe, who is a goddess, a daughter of Helios, also a titan, and she ends up being ostracised from the Greek god community. She does something pretty terrible and she gets banished to this island where she has to live all by herself with just like the animals and the nature. And I love Circe as a character. I feel in large part this is a very character driven novel, and she is a fantastic one. So yeah, those are my witchy book recommendations, some of my favourite books featuring witches and witchcraft that I would recommend to you, especially if you're looking for something of that ilk to read in the next month or so. However, I would of course love to hear more of your witchy recommendations. If you have any, leave them in the comments down below. I will link my fairy video and my dragon video in the description box, although both of those may be due for an update, to be perfectly honest. And if you would like any specific videos in the future on other magical creatures, then let me know. But until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you again soon. Bye everyone!